Thank you, everyone, for coming, and welcome to the third installment of Labor Now. Brought to you by Verso Books and Jacobin. This is number 3 of a 3-part, so far, monthly winter panel series where me, your moderator, brings together trade unionists, labor journalists, and labor historians to talk about the workers' movement in America and sometimes other places. Our very first one was Building Unions Under Trump, where we spoke more broadly about sort of organizing in an environment that is hostile to labor. The second one was about union reform. You can actually find that online, by the way, on Verso's channel, about internally led democratic movements within the unions. And this third one is on the politics of labor. That's very vague, and I understand, and we kept it vague, but I'll just go ahead and read the prompt. Organizing the workplace is one thing, but the long game for any politicized labor movement is to institutionalize worker power and exercise it in the larger political sphere. Questions of state power, policy, party politics, and the role of social democratic reform should be central to the project of a revived labor movement, and thus a revived left. However, the labor movement's attempt to break into party politics have yielded very little. The Democratic Party has both weakened and moved very steadily to the right, and neither the unions nor the progressive left have had much luck in either fortifying the Dems' base or significantly influencing their policy. Fusion voting experiments like the Working Families Party haven't fared much better, and social issue-oriented projects like the Green Party have failed to even make a dent. So, in a country with no party of the workers, how does the labor movement build and exercise power? What is the future of party politics for labor? What is the role of labor in the path to socialism? And what is the ideal relationship between left political organizations and organized labor? So I've actually been very upfront about my long-term goals being a labor party rather than, say, a Green Party or a Socialist Party. And the truth is this panel is largely about party. However, I would like to give a shout out to my own organization over here, Democratic Socialists of America, who are tabling for Medicare for All. Please stop by. Please fill out some information. Also, the Jacobin table is right there. They're like an OK magazine. So unfortunately, Adolf Reed has been very sick today, and he is stuck in Philadelphia. He sends his apologies and his regards, and we hope that we can have him on another panel soon. However, we do have a stacked deck over here. So I'm just going to do some introductions briefly. So Marcus Barnett is here for the United Kingdom. Marcus is an elected regional political officer of the National Union of Rail, Maritime, and Transport Workers. He is the Secretary of London Young Labour, and he is active in the Corbynite group Momentum. He is also a contributor to Jacobin magazine. Mark Dudzik, we have over here, longtime labor activist. He was president of Local 8149, a branch of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers International Union for 18 years. He served as national organizer for the U.S. Labor Party, which he's going to be talking about, and he's currently the national coordinator of the Labor Campaign for Single Payer. Seth Ackerman, over here on the end, is the managing editor of Jacobin magazine, and he pretty recently wrote an article, A Blueprint for a New Party, which he will be talking about. But right now, I think we're actually going to start with Marcus. So Marcus comes from a country with an ascending labor party. This has been very interesting to Americans and very impressive, not only because the Labor Party is ascending, but because it's doing so on the basis of an incredibly left platform, especially when Blairism has for so long been considered kind of a foregone conclusion. So Marcus is going to talk a little bit about the Labor Party, where it comes from, what it does, and why things are changing right now.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me. I was told in my jet-lag state on the way here to make plenty of jokes. I've heard Americans love jokes, but sadly I don't have any, and I'm actually, in fact, going to give you a very dry but certainly factual report on the relatively bumpy but also relatively fruitful relationship that organised labour has had with socialist politics in the United Kingdom. I'd like to begin with discussing the foundation of the Labour Party, which was formed at the tail end of the beginning of the 20th century. The foundation of the party, and core to its immediate and its widespread growth, was the necessary practical blurring between gradualists and liberal reformists like the Fabian Society, the radical, liberal, kind of enlightened journalist class of the UK at the time, the Independent Labour Party, who were overwhelmingly proletarian socialist proselytizers from London and the north of England and Scotland, and the trade union movement. In between the political patronization of the working class by the Fabians and the oftentimes religious utopianism of the original socialists of the ILP, the trade union movement was the core body which engaged in negotiation and leverage with the ruling class. Against forced socialist advance or radical liberal reform, the unions edged between political radicalism and realistic compromise in a rough and oftentimes uneven manner. Though often operating in collective unity with leaders of the major industrial unions, the trade union leadership played an incredibly intelligent political game between the two major British parties at the time, the Tories and the Liberals, in getting the largest amount of political concessions from both organisations. Within the Labour Party, they had the unique block vote system in which a significant chunk of all of the electoral college was given to the trade union official leadership, effectively speaking. This led, obviously, to an often very politically sterilising situation, which most socialists thought neutered the political promise of any Labour Party in the country, led to all sorts of very serious consternation from particularly Marxist organisations like the Social Democratic Federation, who were very, very concerned about the lack of direct political approach towards socialist politics that the Labour Party had at the time. The unions were obviously a very small C conservative organisation. The leap that they made, especially amongst the leadership and amongst their parliamentary wing from liberalism to what you call like Labourism, it was an extraordinarily difficult one, and it was a real risk that they made. In contradiction and in practice, it took the events of World War I, I think, to really push the trade union leadership into an irreversible, confident and comfortable relationship with Labour. Though much of the socialist membership of Labour largely agitated against the war, the unions gained real leverage through the huge growth in war industry and the membership opportunities afforded to the unions. The end of the war brought a radical swing to the left in British society, and Labour's 1918 constitution, 1918, constitution committed the party to nationalisation and state ownership of British industry, a commitment absolutely comfortable to the trade union leadership at the time. Plenty of this social democratic commitment was realised in 1945, where a landslide victory for a radical reformist Labour government saw the coal mines, docklands and much of the steel industry nationalised, as well as, of course, as the nationalisation of our health services in the form of the NHS. The role of the unions in this government, though of course broadly positive in achieving domestic social aims, took a much more reactionary role internationally, with long-term right-wing Labour and trade union stalwart Ernest Bevin, not to be confused with Nye Bevan, allowing the formation of NATO and encouraging the expulsion of anti-American Labour MPs from the Labour Party. Though obviously being bought off in the situation by world imperialism, the trade union leadership managed to maintain a particularly strong influence in post-war British society. These positions taken by the major general unions and the pronouncements of union general secretaries were taken into account by all major state actors between the years 1945 to 74, whether Tory or Labour. And there was often a very, very significant crossover in the House of Lords and the House of Commons between those who often appeared in the head of most senior trade union administrations. However, as the welfarist consensus began to fall to pieces, so too did this political situation. As British society became increasingly volatile in the 70s, the old schema of having broadly right-wing class collaborationist union leaders began breaking as class confrontation became much more seriously pitched. Throughout the incredibly serious and divisive strikes and confrontations that happened throughout industrially declining Britain in the 1970s, left-wingers such as the former International Brigadier Jack Jones and ex-communist Arthur Scargill became nationally influential trade union leaders. Worryingly for the West, even committed communists. There were very, very isolated figures in the 40s, 50s, and 60s in British trade unions. Figures such as Bert Ramilson, the Communist Party's very, very well-respected national industrial organizer, started to entertain from the higher echelons of the trade union leadership an extraordinary amount of influence, which was unheard of at the time. However, all of this development and serious active work of a political nature inside of the trade union movement, no matter how much it was built up, there's no way that it could have been able to have, properly resisted just the sheer onslaught of Thatcherism and what it wrought on the British trade union movement. A disorientated and unimpassioned Labour Party leadership completely failed to relate to any of the changes in British society. They failed to meaningfully back any demonstrations in the early 80s by, say, the nurses or the steelworkers when they were fighting for their industry's future, while the so-called modernising leadership of Neil Kinnock, following Michael Foot's election defeat in 1983, was evidently embarrassed by the vicious class conflict that was unleashed by the miners' strike in 1984-5. This vanquishing of industrial militancy by Tory neoliberalism was historic and quite unheard of. It took much of the left into real demoralization, desperation, ideas that they could achieve some form of minor piecemeal victories elsewhere on the cultural field perhaps, or in various different social movements. But the trade union leadership particularly was sidelined. People such as Tony Blair and Peter Mandelson, often former Euro-communists who became Blairites, were interested in advocating popular liberal, market-based solutions to the problems of the 1980s. Nothing more really than an enlightened wing of the new capitalist reality. Socialist or even just obviously welfarist solutions were not even considered by what became New Labour. And in speeches, quotations, and in media posturing, Tony Blair consciously sought to distance himself and the Labour Party from any association with the trade union leadership or the lost battles of the 1970s. As Peter Mandelson told the Confederation of British Industry, which is like the bosses' union basically in the UK, he is very, very comfortable, quotation mark, with people making millions of pounds in Britain. Meanwhile, the leadership of the party stopped turning up at large-scale union rallies and democratic socialist festivals such as the Durham Miners Gala, the Tolpuddle Martyrs Festival, and so on. So while in government, Labour continued this nonchalance towards the sensitivities of the trade unions and their demands, having very, very serious national confrontations around the time of the Iraq War with the Fire Brigade Union, where disgracefully, and I remember this very well as a teenager, they were labelled the agents of Saddam for disrupting the British government at a time of their build-up to war with the Americans. The postal workers and the CWU were very aggressively attacked as they tried to defend the Royal Mail from privatisation from a Labour government. And also they took on the PCS, Civil Servants Union, the NUT, in a scale of incredibly serious confrontations. To many, Blair's premiership was a historic betrayal. Much of the leadership of the unions became quite seriously radicalised to the left. A group of left-wing leaders, known to the national gutter press as the Awkward Squad, began to emerge, interested in effectively just causing internal havoc inside of and outside of the Labour Party. The left-wing union leadership were admittedly divided on the issue of whether to try and basically create something productive out of what the sort of maelstrom they were creating for Tony Blair within the party. Whether it should move in a left-wing direction again or whether they should just completely leave the Labour Party. But obviously, in the midst of this, some unions, such as my own union, the RMT, and the Fire Brigade Union, found itself outside of the Labour fold, no longer affiliated to the Labour Party, no longer able to have any say in its internal structures. So clearly, at this point, the need for political representation became very crucial and on the minds of many people in the movement. Following Labour's defeat at the 2010 general election, a conscious reshaping of the Labour Party began to take place, led by large general unions such as the General Municipal and Boilermakers, the GMB, and Unite, which is a very large amalgamated union. That was largely perceived to be Unite's backing, which gave the 2010 leadership election to Ed Miliband. Miliband very, very quickly sought some sort of arrangement with the sort of former Blairite leadership. He went very, very cold on the unions, satisfied a lot of the old comms team of Tony Blair and very, unrepresentative anti-democratic cliques in the party, such as the pressure group Progress. The GMB and Unite were very, very aware of this. They felt it keenly, and they started working together to attack Progress. Sir Paul Kenny, by absolutely no means a friend of the left, but a leader of the GMB, began to attack Progress very, very viciously, referring to them as a party within a party and demanding inquiries into their secretive work and commissioning reports into how they're financed. This really, really quite uproarious level of attack culminated in a GMB motion to party conference, ultimately withdrawn, to expel Progress from the Labour Party. So you can see this ratcheting up already of tensions, 6 or 7 years ago. At this point, though, many of the kind of fair-sounding claims about, Corbynism and the spontaneity of it and so on, and it's all very, very fair, but quite a lot of this political situation exists because of what Unites were doing at this period. So while GMB were very aggressively attacking the careerists within the Labour Party, Unite, for the first time in their history, were developing a very, very serious and important, very aggressive political strategy, to take back Labour and try and sort of encourage long-standing trade union activists, isolated left-wingers and up-and-coming people who came out of the anti-war movement or the student movement to begin thinking about standing for Parliament. This strategy was unique in terms of, at least this generation, in how successful it was and the type of candidates that it got selected, especially to safe seats. When you think about the team around Jeremy Corbyn right now, they include people like Rebecca Long-Bailey, Rachel Maskell, Clive Lewis, Cat Smith. All of these people were selected off the back of this selection strategy. It was a really, really extraordinary piece of work, and I don't think it's really talked about much in any of the literature of Corbynism, but it's really, really worth discussing because it was certainly a way, because in the Collins Review in 2013, which was a complete Blairite trick, it was intending to basically have an American-style system within the Labour Party, a primary-style system where, effectively speaking, the whole power of the trade union movement en bloc would be abolished, and we would be electing our leader through a one-member, one-vote system. The way that this was carried meant that Unite just effectively had to turn to the grassroots, had to start enabling its membership again, and created a situation where effectively there was just a huge number of Unite activists willing to put in the work on the ground, just so affronted and offended by how they were treated within their own party, especially from a leader they elected. And obviously this strategy of the Blairites to effectively flush us, the trade union movement, out of the party of the trade union movement, just blew up in their faces as unions voted Corbyn in large numbers as a revenge strategy, effectively. By attempting to defeat the unions, the Blairites, in fact, completely buried themselves and re-established the relevance of a new left-wing union leadership who are now really, really serious veterans of internal party struggle and are completely ideologically committed to the socialist renewal of the Labour Party. To speak a bit more theoretically, I think this is very, very unusual. It's only a creation of a situation where the unions have been just pushed so far, up against the wall. Ralph Miliband wrote a really good book called Capitalist Democracy in Britain, where he, in my opinion, very convincingly argued that unions don't act as radical agencies for socialist change, but in fact they act as agencies of containment of struggle, in his words. The leadership of Labour has obviously always historically acted at this role in a historically explicit level, and the unions always provide this kind of managerial common sense that just instills bureaucratic caution from the higher echelons of the leadership to the rank and file membership. This has been very, very successful, always has been. This conservative logic of a fair day's work for a fair day's pay has always influenced very, very decisively the Labour Party's politics. But I think quite a lot of these parameters are starting to vanish now. While there was, obviously all sorts of discernible processes going on in what created Corbynism, anti-war politics, opposition to industrial marketisation, anti-austerity militancy. I think a big part of this process, which, as I've said, was entirely forgotten, was this increasingly marginalised, increasingly politically radicalised and quite caderised body around the leadership of the trade union movements, which could just mobilise such serious pressure inside and outside of Labour. Combined with a very, very strong grassroots pressure, I think quite a lot of the fundamental assertions of the New Left and people like Ralph Miliband have been cast into doubt, to be quite honest. There seems to be here a living proof that, despite all the warts and all of Labour, you can develop and enable a real transformative political leadership with some very, very decent, hardworking union leaders facing oblivion. I'll try and wrap up now. I think that things are very, very exciting. I think the role of Unite and the GMB particularly in writing significant sections of the latest Labour Party election manifesto, particularly on questions related to traditional industry and its return, the nature of industrial rebuilding in Britain after Brexit, the workers' democratic self-control of industry, and green energy, as well as obviously overturning the draconian anti-union laws we have in the UK, is incredible and quite unprecedented, to be honest. In terms of the home front, we're still trying to take a big chunk of the party back from the right. Momentum, of which I'm a member, has won 20 out of 30 parliamentary selections in marginals at the moment. We are doing, for all of the limitations, we're doing incredibly well, working with the GMB and Unite to ensure that we have socialist, trade unionist candidates going in as MPs to defend that socialist manifesto at the next election, which I think will be a Labour government. And it will be, we will need good MPs to have a socialist economy that will give our citizens dignity and help smash a lot of the neoliberal consensus across Western Europe. Again, this work just couldn't have been done without this very, very unique bond between the radical left and the left of the trade union movement. So thanks for having me. In the meanwhile, we'll be watching your Medicare for All campaign. We'll be inspired in the same way that we were by your complete intransigence during the Bernie campaign. And we hope that you can help build a relationship between socialism and an organized labor that can help build an America that, as our new slogan seems to be going around with, for the many, not the few. Solidarity. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so it has been particularly inspiring watching that shift. I don't think I ever considered the possibility that the Labour Party could be wrested from the clutches of the right wing of Labour.
I don't think anyone did.
Yeah. So congrats on that and keep going. But it does appear that it is that kind of strange and difficult to forge bond between Labour and the left that makes it possible. And thus, sort of my focus for this panel on Labour parties more generally. So on that note, I would actually like to move over to Mark, who is going to talk a little bit about the US Labour Party, which was a really fascinating project and very thoughtfully, planned and, ultimately failed. But I think we have a whole lot to learn from it, especially moving forward as we try to redirect a left movement towards workers again. So, Mark?
Hi. Thank you, Amber. I have to say, I'm just totally impressed that there's so many people out here on a rainy work night in Brooklyn, and that's a tribute, I think, to Amber and the other folks who put this together. So it's great to be here. I've used to, in the last days of the Labour Party, I used to say that I was wandering around the country like a graveyard ghost, trying to, bring people together to talk about these issues. And there's been a real explosion of interest here. It was great to hear Marcus. We paid a lot of attention to the history of the British Labour Party and other social democratic and Labour parties, but particularly the British one, because some very common characteristics, the Labour movement very similar, a lot of the political conditions. And it's funny, we are actually putting the archives of the Labour Party together to donate to the Tamiment collection, and we were reminded that at our founding convention in 1995, Jeremy Corbyn actually attended and spoke at a late evening forum. He didn't speak to the general convention. I think he was actually a guest of some kind of left sort of interventionist group that had wanted to push the Labour Party to do more radical or more, I think more direct electoral intervention before we wanted to do it or whatever. And I vaguely recall that my union kind of sent me there to kind of keep an eye on things. But anyway, we have a picture of, and back then he was like, I didn't know who he was. He was a backbencher at the time. I think he was in Parliament, and he was, a very genial and impressive, thoughtful person in 1995.
Came all the way to Cleveland.
And he came all the way to Cleveland. So that was just kind of a interesting overlap. Second thing I just want to let you know is I didn't come here actually intending to talk much about the history of the Labor Party. My good friend Adolph Reed was supposed to do that, and I was supposed to talk about Medicare for all. And I'm still going to talk to you about Medicare for all because that's my job. But I'll try to, touch on this a little bit to begin, and then we'll kind of move through it.
Turn the mic just a little bit here.
Okay. Is that better? So I like the way that Amber framed this discussion as a discussion to talk about power and how to exercise power, because I think the left in the U.S. in particular has sort of forgotten about that the point of being a left is to exercise power and eventually win power on behalf of a working class. I think the left has been transformed, particularly in the U.S., but, I think this is happening in a lot of places, more as sort of this moral group about moral purpose about bearing witness rather than actually exercising power. And, there's a lot of reasons for that, but, the central task of a left has got to be to think about how to move things forward and to win power on behalf of working people and make a society that represents their interests. So Adolph Reed and I wrote a piece for the 2015 Socialist Register. I see one of the editors, Leo Ponish, is in the room tonight, where we tried to talk about why, what has happened to the left in the U.S. and, try to define what a left ought to be doing. And, basically there's two things that minimally would define a real left as opposed to sort of an aspirational left. Number one, that it would be capable to exercise power on behalf of the working class within capitalism. And secondly, that it could lay out a credible critique of capitalism that moved people to action and developed unity and a common purpose and moved people to action. And, we stated we wrote this, I guess, in late 2014, which was a particularly dark moment, where neoliberalism looked like it was going to last for a lot longer than perhaps it will last. We said, that the left is no longer, in terms of exercising sort of the practical day-to-day power, the left is no longer capable of, even setting like a wage level in the auto industry, which was, the sort of the preeminent industrial post-World War II industry that kind of set a pattern for working class wages in this country and many other countries, nor is it capable of even influencing development decisions in Brooklyn. So it's funny that we're in this neighborhood that obviously was massively redeveloped on a neoliberal model with no input from, a working class alternative. And, those of us who are a little older remember that there was a time when, New York was a working class city. And, it was not a paradise, but, you could, healthcare was free or relatively accessible, and education. I went to City College when there was no tuition at City College. It was there when they actually instituted tuition. And, all of the sort of basic social wage accoutrements that social democracy sort of achieved in the post-war period, to the extent that they existed at all in the U.S., they existed here in New York City. And now we have, this prime real estate being redeveloped for clearly not to serve the interests of the working class. So that sort of indicates where the left is in the U.S. And, it's really been hollowed out by the rise of neoliberalism. And, we would maintain that the U.S. left is particularly vulnerable to the ravages of neoliberalism because of kind of these accidents of history. In particular, the fact that, we emerged from World War II. Most of the capitalist world, the capitalist class, was weakened by World War II because, number one, of their association with fascism and all the barbarism that represented, and number two, because their capital was destroyed in the war. But the U.S. capitalist class emerged pretty strong from World War II and ready to take on a labor movement that also emerged pretty strong from World War II in the U.S. And we basically fought us to a standstill. The expansion of the sort of the New Deal laborist projects was stopped. We never were able to win a jobs bill. We never were able to win Medicare for all or nationalized health care in that period, and the expansion of labor rights. All of these things were defeated in the 1940s. But we were strong enough that we were able to win kind of second best solutions to all of this, which basically resulted in the creation of what people have called the private welfare state, where we were able to negotiate mostly in the first tier of the economy, a pretty elaborate system of social benefits for working people and their families that were provided as a part of the employment relationship rather than provided as a matter of right as a citizen. And that those benefits began to expand throughout society in uniquely unequal ways, particularly, with a labor market and residential markets that were segmented by race and labor segmented by gender. So it had all kinds of unequal reverberations throughout the economy that had long-term impacts. But so that really created a unique problem as we merged into the period of neoliberalism, where we had no sort of base of universal social programs to begin to circle the wagons around and build a common cause for working class struggle. They were able to pick us off and pick off our power, one enterprise at a time. And it was sort of the acceleration of that throughout the 1980s that gave impetus to the rise of the Labor Party movement in the 1990s in the U.S. It took the American labor movement a good dozen years after the rise of neoliberalism, and the seminal moment for that neoliberalism is, if you ask most labor people, was the firing of the air traffic controllers by Ronald Reagan in 1981. The air traffic controllers, who had perversely been about the only U.S. union to endorse Reagan for president, went out on strike over particularly horrendous working conditions that they were suffering under, and they were permanently replaced, and that opened up a whole orgy of union busting throughout the 1980s. We would maintain that neoliberalism actually started several years earlier, actually during the Carter administration, when they began to deregulate key industries like trucking, airlines, and telecommunications, which have thrown millions of workers into poverty, if you look at the impact of those effects. I mean, truck drivers used to be the aristocrats of the highway, and now they're just desperate gypsies wandering around with nowhere to sleep. It's just, if you look at those changes, it's really profound. So finally, after 12 years of thinking this was just sort of a temporary political aberration and that we would get back our seat back at the table and reconstitute the sort of post-war labor management government coalition, finally people began to get wise that there was no longer a table for us to get a seat at, that unions had been basically marginalized by the rise of neoliberalism, and there was no interest on the part of the capitalist class or the government that they installed to reconstitute that. And so people began to really explore alternatives. The labor movement also during this desperate period finally began to develop some innovative new strategies about how to take on the power of capital in the really tough strikes and lockouts and contract campaigns, how to begin to think about new ways to organize and represent their members and mobilize their members. So by the mid-1990s, there was actually upsurge in the labor movement and a real struggle that went on about the future of the labor movement. So 1995 witnessed the only real contested election in the history of the AFL-CIO, and we elected, my union was part of this project, elected a new leadership to the AFL-CIO called the New Directions Slate that had a plan to revitalize the labor movement that would result in organizing 1 million new workers a year, mobilizing people to go out and begin to disrupt the capital on the streets in very aggressive ways, rather than politely allowing our unions to be busted through the legal procedure and everything else. It was a very time of excitement and ferment that was occurring throughout the labor movement. There was an insurrection within the Teamsters Union, which resulted in new leadership in which was at that point the largest union in the United States, the Teamsters Union. They began, they took on United Parcel Service about the issue of decent jobs, the elimination of part-time jobs and creation of decent jobs that was widely supported by the American people, and they won, or they thought they did. It's a long story. So there was all of this ferment that was happening within the labor movement. So within that context, my union and several other, mainly older industrial and transportation unions that had experienced the brunt of these neoliberal onslaught and deindustrialization throughout the 1980s, felt that it was time to begin to talk about the creation of an independent working class party in this country, a labor party. And our slogan was that the bosses have two parties. It's time for us to have one of our own. That was actually thought up by a member of my union who worked in a gypsum mill in Michigan. And we were doing these sort of workplace discussion groups and stuff about why we need a labor party. The other thing that really spurred the rise of that labor party movement and legitimized it within this new insurgent labor movement was the administration of Bill Clinton. Clinton was elected in 1992 after 12 years of Republican rule where there was vicious union busting, raising some hopes and expectation that we could kind of get back into a more centrist approach to labor relations, and immediately moved to block almost all of the aspirations of the labor movement. He put no energy at all into a piece of labor reform legislation that would have made it illegal to permanently replace people who go on strike, striker replacement legislation. He supported legislation that no longer guaranteed that if you're indigent in this country that you would have some kind of basic safety net, welfare reform that said that, there's a limit on the amount of support that you would get. They screwed up health care reform by taking Medicare for all off the table immediately and then trying to negotiate this convoluted process that kept private insurance in the game and tried to regulate it, and nobody understood it. And they bargained against themselves and then lost everything, as any shop steward could have told them. And then the final kicker was the negotiation of the NAFTA agreement, which was the beginning of the real devastation around international trade and what that did to labor rights in every country that those trade agreements touched, not just the U.S., but in that case, Mexico and Canada also were devastated by the impact of these same agreements. And that was all sort of wrought by Clinton. And so there was a growing sense that we were getting no benefit from, our decade-long support of the Democratic Party. So we first launched an organization called Labor Party Advocates that held meetings like this in union halls and meeting halls around the country that began to talk about this and really began to assess that there was a lot of possibility to move this forward, and held our founding convention in 1995. There's a couple of things I think that we did really smartly and really right. First of all, it's interesting that Marcus talks about the block vote in Great Britain and the controversy there. I mean, we looked at the British Labour Party and we liked what we saw regarding the block vote. And I don't think you could build a Labour-based party, at least not in the US, unless the institutional labor movement felt that if they committed the kind of resources and organizing capacity to the project, that they would have the ability to be listened to and have some participation in the governance of that party, and rather than folks who might not represent anything more than themselves. So there was a tension there, certainly within the Labor Party, but we felt very strongly that if you're going to organize a party of labor, you need to have labor at the table from the beginning. And we never were able to, never claimed that we could speak on behalf of the entire institutional labor movement, but we felt that we needed to build a critical mass of the institutional labor movement who were comfortable to be in that room and participating in this project and prepared to talk about a break with the Democratic Party before we could proceed to build a Labor Party. And that if we couldn't do that, we would really be talking about a very different kind of party, more like a Green Party that had some social democratic or other programs, but was not directly rooted in working class institutions and working class structures. So that was a very important debate and discussion and tension within the Labor Party. And then the other thing that we did was that we felt it was very important to understand that the purpose of organizing within the working class was not so much to mobilize an already existing base, because that's what we had seen this happen, and we continue to see this happen in the left. You call a meeting, and it's the usual suspects that come together, and you assemble a list of ideas from that, and you think you've done something. The problem was we didn't have a constituency deep and broad enough to really exercise real power. So the challenge wasn't to mobilize an already existing base. The challenge was to organize a new working class constituency based upon common felt concerns that could bring working people together from different backgrounds and different perspectives. So we used to joke, Tony Mazzocchi, the key labor leader who helped organize this, used to joke that if you can't get an issue passed in your own union hall, don't bring it to the Labor Party and expect us to move on it. That you've got to be able to organize your own base, your own members, to understand the importance of an issue in order to think about integrating that into a broader political strategy. And I think that that's a real fundamental principle about how you do working class organizing and organize working class politics that it's important to remember. And then the third kind of issue that really we struggled with from the very beginning is how do you approach electoral politics? We're in this weird two-party system that has all kinds of bizarre ramifications. Labor as an institution, is deeply embedded in it. And so, there's these two sort of tensions within the labor movement, even at its best, between the sort of transformational vision that we need to break out of this system and the sort of instrumentalist imperatives that you need to do in order to protect the interests and concerns of your members. So, for example, if you represent hospital workers in New York City, you are damn concerned about what the Medicaid reimbursement rate is going to be coming out of Albany next year, because millions of people, or tens of thousands of people's jobs and income rely on those type of decisions. So there's a natural tension in a constituency-driven organization that creates problems, particularly in a winner-take-all two-party system. We felt, some people felt, if you're going to be a party, you got to run candidates. Damn, whatever happens, happens. You have to start to learn to run candidates. Others, and I count myself among them, felt that we needed to build power first, and elections existed to ratify that power, not to build the power. And elections, I believe, by their very nature, are the least power-building activity that leftists can engage in. Because the nature of elections is basically you have to win an election. It's the least common denominator. So you go out and you do the basic things to do to get out the vote, to mobilize people to vote for a candidate. And there's sort of limited capacity there. Nonetheless, we all were united about the idea that we needed to develop a strategy that would inevitably break with the Democratic Party. We rejected this concept that things like fusion politics could be an effective way to exercise power long-term. That's a tactic that maybe helps you a little bit within the two-party system, but it's not a solution to this problem of no working-class political party. So, we began to move in those kind of directions. I thought there was some very healthy and interesting discussions and debates. We began to experiment a little bit with thinking about how to build some electoral presence, but we never kind of reached escape velocity. We never were able to convince a substantial section of the institutional labor movement at the time had come to break decisively with the Democratic Party. In retrospect, we probably should not have called ourselves a full-blown party. We should have remained an organizing committee throughout this period. It created a level of expectation that we were unable to deliver. But in our defense, we were operating at a time when the labor movement looked like they were going to organize 1 million workers a year. And, we thought that in a movement that vibrant, that was going to double in size in a little over a decade, that, it would be quite conceivable that we could also build a real working class independent political party. But that didn't happen. In fact, labor experienced a strategic defeat by the turn of the century. Bush was appointed president. We went to war all over the world. The politics shifted. Labor union busting reemerged even more powerfully. Politics became all about anybody but Bush. And there was no space, while labor was in wide retreat, there was no space to really begin to talk about this sort of transformational political movement called the Labor Party. And so we really, the possibilities really narrowed to the point that by 2006, we basically put it on the shelf and decided that we needed to explore other opportunities of building a working class movement. So I used up almost all of my time talking about the Labor Party because I get so passionate about it. But basically, as the Labor Party shut down, we kind of, one of the things that we worked on that we felt was really effective is begin to develop sort of issue-based organizing around key issues that kind of challenged capital in a central way and that were crucially important to working class people in this country. And so, the three key campaigns that really resonated with the Labor Party were the campaign for free higher education, which, by the way, the Sanders campaign adopted almost lock, stock, and barrel in terms of the analysis and the framework for it. A campaign for workers' rights to redefine workers' rights as basically as a human right rather than this sort of weird definition of labor rights as connected to commerce regulation and stuff. And campaign for Medicare for All, which we call the Just Healthcare campaign. And so as we were phasing down the Labor Party, we did sort of try to keep a lot of that kind of organizing going, and we brought the approach of the Labor Party and our Just Healthcare campaign into this new fight that was growing around Medicare for All that emerged as at the end of the Bush administration, as the healthcare crisis was really resonating in America, and the economic crisis hit in 2008, and Obama arose and ran on an issue of healthcare. So we launched the Labor Campaign for Single Payer in 2009, right before the inauguration of Obama, and we really wanted to use that as an opportunity to sort of intervene in the debates over healthcare policy and to use it to sort of drive some change within the institutional labor movement to inspire the labor movement to kind of step into this fight and challenge both the Democratic establishment and the medical industrial complex, regarding healthcare policy. Quite honestly, we thought that when we launched it, that we would probably last through the debate after the Obama administration got elected that would result in whatever legislation it resulted in, that we'd probably lose that fight, and then, we'd have to reorganize and move on to something else. But that didn't happen. In fact, we grew stronger in the course of that fight, even when the Affordable Care Act passed, which we felt was completely inadequate to the issues. We continued to gain momentum both within the labor movement, and this campaign continued to gain momentum throughout American politics. And that, I think, is really because first of all, the crisis in healthcare is so severe and so widespread. It affects almost every working class and middle class family in this country in myriad ways, and is one of the biggest drivers of insecurity in working class life. The fear of impoverishment because of a major medical condition in your family is one of the greatest fears that families have in this country. And that's really continued to generate from below the sort of activism and demands on that. On top of that, within the institutional labor movement, the whole idea that healthcare should be linked to employment, which was one of these accidental second-best deals that we did in the 1940s, began to collapse. And there's a growing consensus within the institutional labor movement that employment-based healthcare is just unsustainable. It's unsustainable economically. You can't negotiate the kind of money that private for-profit healthcare costs in this country, 2 times the average in the industrial world that we spend for healthcare. So, for example, last year, the consulting group that consults on employment healthcare estimated that the average working class family of 4, the total cost for that family's health care was $26,000 a year, of which employers paid about $15,000. So if you talk about low-wage workers, for example, these numbers are just insurmountable. $26,000 a year is $13 an hour for 2,000 full-time hours in a year. And $15,000, which is the average employment payment, is $7.30 an hour, which is higher than the federal minimum wage. So when you're organizing, and I was talking to the hotel workers in the Bay Area in California a few months ago, you're organizing non-union hotel workers in the East Bay making $11 an hour. Not only do you have to get them up to the $16 an hour wage that hotel workers in San Francisco average, you have to also come up with another $20,000 a year for the health care benefits, to provide decent health care benefits. So an employer knows that when they fight the union drive in that situation, they can, if they win, they save $14 an hour, which is more than what they're paying their workers right now. So the stakes are just so high when you're in that kind of a fight. In addition to that, even higher wage workers, these numbers just no longer work. You get the competition from non-union employers who don't have these kind of costs. You look at what's happening even among construction industries in most parts of the country, not so much yet in New York City, but even here you see the erosion of union density in commercial construction. These are realities. In addition to that, not only is it economically unsustainable, it's politically unsustainable. Our opponents, the right-wing populists and the corporate Republicans have learned how to use the politics of resentment to undermine good, decent working-class health care. So you look at the attacks on public workers, and people demagogues will say, look at those freaking teachers, they don't pay a penny for their health care. Why should your tax money go to give them all this great health care when you don't get any health care on your job? Why should they get all the great health care and you get nothing? New York Times 2 days ago had an excellent piece interviewing middle-class, working-class people in New Hampshire who are buying health care on the ACA exchanges, and their income is at a point where they get no subsidies for that health care. And guess where their anger is being turned at? Is it being turned at the insurance industry that's charging them $18,000 a year for a crappy policy with $8,000 deductibles? Or is it turned at the people who are getting subsidized health care and are eligible for Medicaid? So the politics of resentment are driving a real hole in there that makes employment-based health care unsustainable. So there's a growing consensus within the institutional labor movement that we need to move. We had a really excellent debate at the AFL-CIO convention last October that built some real understanding about how to move forward. And we also think that this campaign for Medicare for All can drive some real change within the labor movement. It can really move unions away from some of the worst features of what people call fortress unionism, which is a tendency to circle the wagons and try to protect what you have and not really find any way to expand what you have into other constituencies. And this sort of has a tendency then to have the working class interests that you're defending being seen as special interests that are not the same interests as other working people. And this, by fighting for health care for all, by making health care a right for everybody, you move beyond fortress unionism to speak on behalf of the entire working class. So the Vermont state employees, for example, had a very good slogan with their members. They said, look, the only way we're going to hold on to the health care that we have is if we fight to make sure that everybody in Vermont has the same health care that we have. And then they went to the people of Vermont and said, we will fight to make sure that you have all of the health care benefits that we have won over the years. And so they reframed that issue in a way that was be able to move it out as a class issue rather than see it as a question of self-interest. I think this fight also helps us question our political relationships and the complicity of the Democratic establishment with the neoliberal capitalist class. As these tensions develop, you see these stresses. The very interesting fight's been going on in California in the Democratic Party there. The proponents of the state single-payer plan in California, led by the nurses union there, have basically identified the Democratic Party establishment as the primary obstacle to winning a single-payer style state system in California. So it really reopens this discussion about why we need a party of our own and begin an experimentation on how to build it. And then finally, victory requires a powerful grassroots movement directed against corporate power. The medical industrial complex is the biggest, most profitable industry in the history of capitalism. And this fight has to go directly up against them. We like to say that this is not a question about policy issues, about who has the best idea, because you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out how to make health care a right for everybody in America. Every industrialized country has done it. We've done it somewhat well for Medicare. What we need is power. We need the power to defeat this corporate conglomerate that stands between the American people and their health care. And so building that movement, affirms the whole issue of public good, affirms the sphere of the public good, the decommodified spheres versus the commodity spheres, and really opens up a whole broad range of working class organizing. So I would just maintain that it's impossible to envision a movement that's strong enough to win Medicare for all, that's not going to also win a $15 wage for everybody, that's not also going to move forward on issues like mass incarceration and social and racial justice issues, that's not going to begin to tackle the housing crisis and the education crisis in this country. This is a wedge issue that can really begin to transform politics. So, you know, we like to look at, you know, like to say that the fight to win Medicare in 1965 actually resulted in the desegregation of the American hospital industry, because Medicare, for the first time, said that if a hospital received Medicare benefits, they had to desegregate their institutions. And we believe that the fight to win Medicare for all is going to really result in a new birth of workers' power in America and a new political movement. So that's what I have to say, and I'm sorry I wandered a little too far, but Amber was very polite.
And anything to bring people over to the table, please sign up. We're going to have a lot of different activities coming up. There's going to be a canvassing program that's going to hit the ground as soon as it's not this particular weather. And yeah, I really do believe that this is the best way to start building broad popular support for the sort of policies that we need to sort of cohere a working class movement. But back to a party of our own, the great fantasy that we're all thinking of. So we would go on to Seth, who actually wrote a blueprint for a new party in, I forget, okay, 2018. And I think this was a really interesting project because it's extremely difficult to try and prefigure what a party would look like. There's so many steps in between the idea of an actual party and sort of building the mass support we would need for that party to function. I think Seth goes into some detail about what that process would actually be, what's necessary, what we can do with and outside of the Democratic Party. And it's the sort of thinking I think we need a little more of. We need to get down to brass tacks. So Seth is going to talk a little bit about that right now.
Thanks. Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. So I wrote an article about this on the subject a little more than a year ago. It came out right after the 2016 election. And I was just reminded when Mark was talking about the article that he and Adolf Reed had co-written in the Socialist Register in 2014. I remembered for the first time that actually reading that piece was one of the things that had started me thinking on the train of thought that led to the article I published about a blueprint for a new party. And the issue of how do you get to the point where the United States could have a viable working class party, a labor party, is kind of like this double problem. Because on the one hand, we lack the kind of mobilizational capacity, we lack the power, the size of the constituency and the class consciousness and all the rest of it. But then on top of that, we also lack a vehicle, an institutional vehicle. And all of our experiments with trying to generate what we in the United States, and I think this is very telling, call a third party, which doesn't make any sense because I mean every party could be the third party if there's three of them. But that's kind of gives the nature of the reality. So we're facing the problem that we don't have a lot of confidence in the institutional nature of what that party is going to be, and we also at the moment lack the kind of wherewithal to be able to form that party and make it a success at the moment. But if we're going to be thinking in the long term, and if we start thinking, well, what happens if we do find ourselves in a moment of political upsurge for the left or for the labor movement, the kind of hope that we were feeling at the time when Bernie Sanders was having his primary campaign, and for the first time in a long time, people were thinking and talking about issues, class issues that they hadn't been talking about for a long time. If we were to get to the point where that merged with an upsurge in working class militancy on the ground and the creation and growth of the institutional labor movement, at that point, then I can guarantee you that we would start being forced, whether we liked it or not, to start thinking about how exactly can we translate that into institutional political power, despite all of the many failures that have littered the history of American left politics. So those were the ideas that I was trying to hash out in the article I wrote, which was called "Blueprint for a New Party." It wasn't called "Blueprint for a Labor Party," but at the end of the piece, I tried to make clear that, in my view, and this is not unfortunately yet a universally shared view on the broader left, but to me it's kind of incontrovertible, that in my view any left-wing political party that could possibly have any chance of success would have to be deeply rooted in the in the institutional labor movement, and that's why I think that those discussions about block votes and the institutional tie between trade unions and that kind of a political party are actually very important discussions. But in my article, I tried to go back and look historically first at why the United States doesn't have a labor party, and that is an age-old, almost kind of a hoary old question in political science and comparative history, sociology. Why did the United States, unlike almost every other industrialized country in the world, fail to develop a mass labor party? And I'm not going to try to solve that debate here as I'm talking. In the 19th century, there are a number of candidates that are probably good candidates for explaining why, at that point, when late 19th, early 20th century, when other labor movements around the world were developing their own independent parties, such as in Great Britain, why we didn't in the United States. Some of those factors at that point that I think are promising candidates are the fact that, for one thing, our working class was extremely divided in terms of, in a lot of ways, ethnically and in other ways. Religion was actually a huge factor, because at that time the Republican and Democratic parties were highly identified with Protestant and Catholic religious communities. So if you were a trade union leader, and even if you were sympathetic to the idea of forming an independent party, then you would have to answer the question, well, what if half my membership is Catholic and the other half is Protestant, and we put up a candidate and it splits the vote, and it's going to split the vote and throw it one side or the other? Will I be able to keep my membership united behind this strategy, despite the fact that it's probably going to affect one side in that ethno-religious conflict more than the other? That was, for example, the kind of one factor. There was the old issue of the fact that the United States became a democracy, cross-class white male suffrage, before it industrialized. So whereas in other countries the struggle to achieve universal suffrage was in many ways the uniting issue that brought together working classes to form a political project and not just fight for their rights on the shop floor, that issue was not really an issue in the United States. And of course, there's a factor that doesn't get mentioned often enough, which is the fact that the United States was a far more violent and repressive environment for working class organizing in the 19th century than any other industrialized country that became a democracy. In the United States, strikes that in other countries, very similar strikes, would end up leading to the formation of durable, large, powerful mass unions in the late 19th century. The Dockers strike, for example, in Britain in the 1880s, those strikes in the United States tended to end up with the workers getting massacred rather than having their unions recognized. And that's a major factor too. But none of those factors are the things that I was focusing on most in my article, because I wanted to focus on something that is less often talked about. And that's something that took place only mostly in the 20th century. And that was the radical reform, radical transformation of the way that the mechanics of elections and political parties are carried out in this country, which took place in a way that most people have. It's kind of a forgotten story, and there hasn't been a tremendous amount of historical writing about it. But roughly from like 1890 to 1920. State by state, because in this country, most of the power to regulate elections and political parties and all of that is at the state level, which is a very important difference and very important feature of our system. State by state, over the course of those years, those decades, the party leaders of the two governing parties in the United States, Republicans and Democrats, in their state legislatures, completely transformed the electoral system, the actual system of running elections and what the rules are for that, into something that has absolutely no parallel anywhere else in the world. It brought about, and there's a lot of mind-numbing details that I'm going to avoid going into completely, but for one thing, it resulted in a system in which, unlike every other country, political parties in this country are treated legally as, in the phrase often used in the juridical literature, they're regulated public utilities. They are not private voluntary organizations with the rights of free association the way that the ACLU or the American Legion are able to freely associate under those constitutional rights. Instead, they're treated as quasi-appendages of the state, and therefore the state has the power and uses that power to regulate how they conduct their affairs internally, to regulate how they choose their candidates, to regulate how they organize their leadership structures in terms of their bylaws. And of course, another feature that has no parallel elsewhere, the government runs the candidate selection process in this country. That again, it would be, it's hard for Americans, I think, to wrap our minds around how strange that is. But the idea that, the British government would run the Labour Party election and set the rules for that, I think would be, even the suggestion of that would sound very strange and foreign probably to British people, and it would sound strange and foreign everywhere else. It would be like, again, saying that, the government has the right to set the rules for how, Verso Books chooses its leadership, or, how the American Legion chooses its leadership. So these are all extremely unusual features that were part of this revamping of the electoral system that had a number of goals, but the overarching goal was to consolidate the monopoly or duopoly of the two major political parties, and to kind of tamp down the kinds of internal conflicts that would come up within those parties, which would often get violent and rowdy at their meetings and so on, before that system had been put in place. So the way that Americans elected our leaders in the 19th century was totally different from the way it is now. The government didn't run the elections. There was no ballot there's no voting booth. There was nothing that you would check a box on. You could bring a piece of an envelope and write who you were going to vote for on the back of the envelope and deposit it in the box, and that was it. There was no such thing as ballot access. You didn't have to apply to the government to have the right to be a candidate or to the right to be a political party that participated. You could just show up on election day in principle and say, well, I'm the party of, New Fredonia, and here's my slate of candidates, and hand out tickets to all the voters, and they would take a ticket and they would put it in the ballot box, and that was the way it was done. All of that changed over the subsequent decades. So that by 1920 we had more or less the system we have now, and over the subsequent decades, from let's say World War I until through the late 1940s, when the labor movement and the left were sort of reaching their apex in terms of their organized political power in this country, those rules were tightened even further dramatically, so that the requirements for getting on the ballot as an independent candidate or as a new political party, for having a political party's name on the ballot, those requirements were strengthened, were made more stringent by many multiples, to the point where it essentially became illegal in many states for any party other than the Democrats and Republicans to get on the ballot. Now, if you were to, and by the way, there was before the episode that Mark participated in of creating a Labor Party in the 1990s, the previous major attempt at that had been in the 1940s, right after World War II. Not a real attempt, but the previous time when there had been serious discussions in the labor movement, in the institutional labor movement, about creating an independent party, was in 1946, amidst a lot of disappointment over Harry Truman's performance since he had taken office. And at that point, you had people like Walter Reuther, the head of the United Auto Workers. You had A.P. Randolph, the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. The heads of many of the powerful unions, not only sympathetic, but actively pressing in the background for discussions on those ideas. It didn't happen for a number of reasons. I think the most important reason was sort of Cold War tensions within the unions at that point. But in those discussions, if you go back and look at how people were debating those, whether we should do that, one of the major issues that the experts in the labor movement were saying would be a major reason not to do it was they said, look at the ballot access requirements that we would have to surmount in every state by state in every state. And that was one of the central arguments they made. So I'm not going to try to make any blanket statement, historical, claims about the definitive reason why we never developed a mass labor party in this country. But I will say that, in my opinion, this complex of regulations that we have been bequeathed by that history today represents a central obstacle, not only to actually forming that kind of a party and having it be successful, but in my opinion, even allowing us to really visualize or get a sense of what it would mean to have our own party. Because in this country, the very concept of party has become conflated with the Democratic and Republican parties, which in many ways are not parties at all, not recognizable parties at all by international standards. For example, the Democratic Party has no membership. You can't be a member of the Democratic Party. You can be a member of the Labor Party. There's, I imagine, an application that you can download on the internet and you fill it out, and maybe there's a dues that you pay. Nothing like that in the United States. Try to go on the Democratic Party's website or whichever, DNC or whatever. You will not find anything like that.
They'll sell you a card for a few $100.
They will sell you a card. Oh, they'll sell you lots of stuff. You can get a tote bag, you can get a mug, but you can't have an actual vote in the Democratic Party, and that's for a reason, because they don't want that to take place. The Democratic and Republican parties in this country, and unfortunately because of those laws, any party that obtains ballot access, Green Party, Socialist Party, whatever it is, in most states, there's variations in the regulations, but in most places, they are not, the political parties in this country are not membership organizations the way they are in every other country. Instead, what they essentially are, I mean, it's very difficult to define them, and the legal literature, when all these court cases, when there's challenges to ballot access requirements and things like this, and the judges have to come up with these like cockamamie, rationalizations for why, this thing is constitutional, but this other thing is unconstitutional. The purpose is always to make sure that the Democrats and Republicans maintain their duopoly, but they have to put it in some sort of legal rationalization. It becomes, it becomes like a completely unmanageable process for them, and it's riddled with all these contradictions, which is very well understood and commented on by legal scholars. In this country, the Democratic and Republican parties, or those kinds of parties, are not membership organizations. They are essentially associations of office holders. So people who already are in office, who've been elected, form an association. They have a logo, they have a name, they have a headquarters, and then instead of having a mass membership that can serve as an avenue for ordinary people to have a voice, an organized voice in politics, what it ends up being is a kind of like rallying point for these office holders to sort of rile people up and say, vote for us, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys, and make it kind of like a sporting event, And that's how Americans relate to our parties. And unfortunately, the worst thing is that most Americans don't even have a concept that that's actually a very unusual, an unusual phenomenon, and something that that is obviously completely incompatible with democratic politics in any kind of a deep sense. So those are the problems that we are dealing with today. And in my article, I put forward some proposals for what I think, if and when we get to the point where labor is in a position to contest seriously for independent political power, how exactly in the nuts and bolts way, in the nuts and bolts fashion, it should do that. We're dealing, obviously, with tremendous constraints. So there's no first best solution in this system. We will always be dealing with whatever route we go in terms of independent party politics. We will always be dealing with a highly with a second best situation. But what I propose in the article, and this is something that has in many ways only recently become possible. So in some sense, in a sense, there's kind of like a very hopeful lesson I think can be drawn from the situation we're in, because I want to step back for a second and say that in addition to all the regulations I mentioned before, in the 1970s they set up a whole extra set of regulations concerning campaign finance. And those were the post-Watergate, Federal Election Act, Federal Election Commission, all of the restrictions and regulations concerning how parties and candidates raise money. And that system, in addition to serving whatever role it did in trying to prevent corruption or trying to prevent bot elections or whatever, also was written and designed to ensure the dominance of the two parties. What's changed is that in 2010, the Supreme Court issued its Citizens United judgment. And in my opinion, it's a great irony of history that this, that judgment, which was like such a pure expression of a kind of a plutocratic vision of politics, where basically these conservative justices believed that giving $1 million to a candidate is freedom of speech, and that's unimpeachable. And if you want to, it's what Mitch McConnell calls private sector participation in politics, which is very important to protect and promote. But ironically, Citizens United, by basically dismantling not all but most of the edifice of campaign finance regulation, actually opened a tremendous avenue for a new political party or party-like organization or whatever you want to call it in the future to be able to actually organize itself as a mass membership organization, to have an independent platform, to choose its own candidates by the membership, to do all the things that political parties in other countries in democratic societies are supposed to do, and also to be able to have an independent financial base so that they control their own resources, and those resources are used as a kind of leverage over the leadership and the candidates that they run. So in other words, you elect somebody who says they're going to do all these wonderful things, they get into office. How do you make sure that they keep doing those things? One of the ways you do that is by concentrating the political resources that your party has at your command, and only doling them out to those candidates who follow the rules and you follow the platform, respect the program that the membership has established, and so on. Again, all these things are very basic principles in other countries. It's kind of just the common sense of elections. What Citizens United has done in getting rid of the whole system of campaign finance regulations is it's made it possible to kind of do an end run around the entire system of party regulation, not just the campaign finance part, but all the stuff they set up in the tens and teens and 20s, the primaries and all of that kind of stuff. Because what it did is it made it possible to establish a membership organization today. It doesn't have to be a quote-unquote party in the American definition. It doesn't have to apply for ballot access and put its name on the ballot. It would be great if it could, but it doesn't have to. It can evade all of the regulations that stem from the act of requesting and getting ballot access, which then places any party under this whole system of Kafkaesque regulations, and evades it by just having, by basing its legal right to exist and its legal right to act on freedom of association, the kind of freedom of association that is supposed to apply constitutionally to any organization. So we set up, we establish the organization, we establish the membership, we establish dues, we establish a program, we select our leadership, we do all the things that a political party does. We don't request that this political party get ballot access, in the states that have the normal, usual American regulations. And instead, we try to build an independent constituency, and if you want to call it this, a political brand, among the mass public, through the normal means. You have a logo, you have a name, you have rallies, you have demonstrations, you have flyers, and so on. You manage to create an association in the mind of the mass public between your program, your political vision for the future, here in this 20-point document or whatever, and the rhetoric of the politicians who are representing you, of your party leadership, and so on. You create an association between those ideas on the one hand and this organization that we've set up on the other hand, so that in the same way that any person, even if they're not very political, out in America, if you ask them, what does the Democratic Party stand for? What does the Republican Party stand for? They'll have an answer. They think they know. They're familiar with these things. Maybe in some distorted or under-informed way, but there's a familiarity there. and be able to establish that kind of, or try to establish that kind of a mass awareness of our political program and its association with our organization, and then take the step of running candidates in elections under our banner who are accountable to our membership and to us, who receive their financing solely from our organizations, which is now possible to do in practically unlimited amounts thanks to Citizens United. Even though, and to take this question of the ballot line of how will these candidates appear on the ballot on election day when the voter's in the voting booth, take that off the table and say that the answer to that question depends on whatever the most practical circumstances are in a particular case. You look at the election laws of your state, you look at the partisan coloration of the district or the state that you're competing in, are there more Republicans than Democrats or whatever. All of these things play a role in determining what is the best way to put your candidate on the ballot. Should you run in a Democratic primary? Should you run as an independent, nonpartisan candidate? At the municipal level, in most places in this country, that's not even an issue because all races are nonpartisan, so the party ballot appearance doesn't make any difference. But all of these decisions, each of these decisions would be made on a case-by-case basis, depending on whatever would maximize the chances of success in that particular race. And instead of relying on that party label in the ballot box on the ballot, as the only link in the voter's mind between this particular candidate and some broader program, we do it ourselves. With our lawn signs and our flyers and our posters and our demonstrations and so on, we create that link outside of the sort of ballot booth situation. So we're not there yet. I mean, even if we were to start, anyone is free to establish an organization and try to do stuff. I don't think that we're at the point where, at a national level, and I happen to think it's important that it be a national organization because that's how most Americans think about politics. Most people know a lot more about national politics than they do about state politics or local politics. They don't turn out to local elections the way they do to national elections. All of the evidence is clear that people think in national terms, and therefore if you want to create a political brand, you should do it at the national level, ideally. We don't have the political wherewithal today to do that in a way that would accomplish our goals. But if and when the time comes, I think that, I've argued at least that this is the kind of model that would be really promising. And with the success that Bernie Sanders had in his campaign in getting people to talk about new issues just by running a campaign that didn't even win, just by having that concentration of attention at the national level on somebody delivering a message that you normally don't hear in our very constricted political system. The amazing success that he had raising money from small donors, which is presumably how we would want to raise most of our money outside of donations from trade unions. And also the broader political trends in party politics these days, where political scientists are increasingly noting how the parties themselves are kind of disintegrating as the governing forces in primary elections, and instead you have all these outside groups. In the Republican Party, the Koch brothers organizations are kind of the classic example of that. They're the ones who are choosing the candidates or are helping to choose the candidates, rather than some smoke-filled room filled with Republican politicos. All of these trends, I think, are very auspicious for the day when hopefully we have the capacity to be able to organize something like this and have it have a chance of success. So that's my proposal.
Okay, so thank you, Seth. It's very warm in here, so I'm going to lead a sort of brief conversational Q&A, and then you may disperse and drink more to cool yourselves off. So first of all, one of the interesting things that I sort of saw in the Corbyn campaign was that it was, as you noted, not the result of some sort of massive resurgence in trade unionist power. And it was quite the opposite. And currently we are at a low point for the trade unionist movement in America, so to speak. And so that is somewhat reassuring. That we're not completely completely out to sea. But there is this question of, is there a critical mass of labor participation that is necessary to move forward with any kind of power and party politics? And if so, what is that? And is it maybe enough to have a minority of extremely politically committed people within the existing labor movement? And you may all answer as you come to your conclusions.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, as I said, it really wasn't this case that it was a very emboldened movement which elected Corbyn. Obviously, it's incredibly oppositional and aggressive and interested in taking power and changing Britain irreversibly from now on. But I think to be quite frank, the sort of candidate everybody believed to be the union's favourite, which was the soft left candidate Andy Burnham, had he played his cards a lot better, had he voted against the cutting of the child tax credits, had he not publicly denounced the trade unions and said he didn't want their money to curry favour with the right, I think he had a very, very strong chance of winning it. I mean, that was really his to lose, In the same way that the 2015 general election was the soft left leader of the Labour Party's, opportunity to lose it. It's the exact same logic for Andy Burnham. It was just a real case of just hundreds of thousands of people just saying, you know what, if this is the way the Labour Party's going, well, fuck them, just fuck them all. We're going to get this vegetarian granddad in instead. It was a very, very unusual set of affairs. Your question is about the...
If there's a necessary kind of critical mass for any kind of left movement to take hold within electoral politics, if there's a critical mass within the labor movement that is necessary, yeah.
I mean, if your question is whether it's necessary for trade unionists or whatever to be involved in these processes,
Yeah.
I'm
giving you a layup
It's
here.
a little 21st century for me, that word, critical mass.
Is there a certain number of highly committed left-leaning trade unions that are necessary to produce an actually left candidate?
Yeah, I mean, I do believe that there was a very, very useful situation amongst the trade union movement and amongst certain sections of Young Labour. People from a very, very specific kind of political tradition in the Labour left and the trade union movement who really, really kept to their guns for, since 1997 until about 2013, 14, 15. Just a very, very small committed group of people that were just, they had a very, very strong institutional grasp on several trade unions and just refused to bend to the soft left, refused to bend to the right on several issues. And I think they really, really held it together at a time when not a lot of other people did. So yeah, I do think, I'm obviously not going to fetishize bureaucracy in any way, but I think that we can't rule these people out either, and I think it's really important to have some form of political strategy which includes these people and not just kind of, sort of runs away with any kind of grassroots, spontaneous fantasies about these things. And your second question was, sorry?
No, that was exactly what I wanted you to say.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there is some, I think, in the States sort of the impression that, there was this huge youth movement, and that's what produced Corbyn because, there's been a huge decline in trade union power. And I think that's simply untrue. But I would also be interested to hear from Mark, especially, what do you think is, what kind of density in union participation do you think is necessary?
You need the exact number or the...
Yes, please. I would like a pie chart, if you have it on hand.
Look, first, I think it's really important to understand the sort of what's happened to left and social democratic parties throughout the industrialized world and their sort of co-optation and integration into neoliberalism, and then the recent revolts against them. I think they're very interesting, and now the limitations of some of those revolts, as we saw with Syriza in Greece and with the Workers' Party in Brazil, and that stuff is really important for us to understand as we try to build a working class politics here. But I would maintain that we have never had the luxury of having a working class party that's been sold out to the capital, and that we we are starting from a very kind of a different experience. And part of that experience is we have a multi-class political party where the most substantial working class institutions, the institutional labor movement, is embedded right now in that party. And if we have to batter down the walls of that party, we are going to need a chunk of that institutional labor movement to pull out of that party and to lead the fight for a new party. Now, some of those folks, and I have no illusion about this, there will be struggle in this party that, someday we create. There will be bitter struggle about how to build that party and how to move it forward. Some of it will be not worth spending 4 hours after work to engage in, but some of it will be really crucial and fruitful struggle. And, but we need to get to that point where we can begin to differentiate, where we can go from there. So I think, it's inconceivable to me to build an independent working class politics in this country without a substantial section of the institutional labor movement, and then also because of the dynamics here, some sections of this sort of new labor that's begun to evolve around kind of new non-bargaining kind of organizing and worker centers and things like that.
You also mentioned, and this is something I actually have a lot of experience with. For a while, I worked in the offices of DSA, and I was basically a secretary, and I would manage, for example, our mailing lists. One of the lists we used to use was the Nation magazine subscriber list, which used to be a great way for us to find members, to find socialists, or, soft social democrats, whatever. And what we found is that after the Iraq War, that list became useless to us because the Nation stopped being or its subscribership stopped being of the left and started being not Bush. You mentioned that the anybody but Bush kind of sentiment was very distracting and definitely redirected the focus of left politics, and it was a real problem. Right now, we happen to have, we'll just say, a Republican president. At the same time, though, if you go to the UK right now and you talk to people who are involved with Labour, and specifically the left wing of Labour with Momentum, you wouldn't know that there was a right-wing government in charge. It's completely shocking. I mean, it could be 5 years. But they're 100% sure that Jeremy Corbyn is going to be prime minister. So, I'm by no means an accelerationist because I saw what kind of Bush did to the left as it was. But I do wonder what your thoughts are on sort of creating a left out of a right-wing administration.
Talking to me?
Yeah.
I think there's two real interesting things that have happened. One is that the Sanders campaign, coupled with the economic crises, opened up a narrative about democratic socialism that, quite frankly, when we wrote for the Socialist Registers, we didn't anticipate that kind of broadening of a discussion about what a anti-capitalist democratic socialist politics would be, and that you could politically popularize that. So that's, I think, a very interesting development that took place that we didn't anticipate. And likewise, when Seth's article, which I think is a very important article that got lost in the dejection after the Trump election last year, and now that you're editor of Jacobin, you ought to republish it maybe. But Adolf Reed and I wrote a sort of a commentary on that article, and when we wrote it, which was probably August, September of 2016, we were anticipating that we were going to elect, and there is no alternative neoliberal for the next 4 years, and that would characterize the politics. And instead, we elected a right-wing populist, who I would maintain that both these polls, the Bernie Sanders poll and the Trump poll, are sort of a reflection of the crisis of legitimacy of neoliberalism. That the narrative that there is no alternative, Hillary Clinton, you're never going to have Medicare for all, so we'll try to make things as good as we can for you. Those coal jobs are going away, so we're going to help train you to be baristas in Brooklyn, and you can live in your car and have a great life. That kind of people rejected that wholeheartedly, and they turned in two directions. They turned towards a direction of hope and towards a direction of right-wing populism, which I would broadly say is sort of it's defense of neoliberalism, but it defends it by first scapegoating marginalized, vulnerable people using racial, gender, all of that kind of stuff. And secondly, creating the illusion that a strong leader will intervene in the market on your behalf. And that's, I think, what's unique about what Trumpism is and a lot of these other right-wing populist movements. I really was struck by that. Last January, I visited the picket lines there's a chemical plant north of Albany that had this bitter, brutal strike, Momentum Chemical, and hopefully some of you were involved in the support of that, because it was a vicious strike. This big gold chemical plant in the middle of nowhere had been bought out by hedge funds. They had looted the plant and looted the workers' funds, and now they were after the final few crumbs left on the table, and the workers were fighting it, and it looked pretty tough. So I was up there walking the picket lines with them, and the local leadership is very progressive. They were big Bernie Sanders supporters. They send people to Labor Notes Conference and stuff, but the workers, had all different kind of ideologies. And there was a substantial group of workers on those picket lines fighting for their lives who were telling each other, if only Trump knew what was happening to us up here, he would take care of this shit. He wouldn't let this stuff happen if only he knew. Meanwhile, the hedge fund that's looting them is closely aligned with this guy Mnuchin, who becomes the Secretary of Treasury. So, it's all smoke and mirrors, but there's a belief that that's happening. So I think that, within that context, there's a different political alignment here that creates some real opportunities to move forward. The rejection of the attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act, merged into a fight for Medicare for all, because people decided, they weren't just fighting for the right to buy a crappy private insurance policy on a state exchange. They were fighting for the right to health care. And if you watch some of the videos of these town hall meetings, even when they were talking to Democratic congresspeople who were promising to defend the Affordable Care Act, people they were in motion and they were confronting politicians around these issues. So I think that this has created a very interesting, unique moment of opportunity and an opening that, I'm actually pretty optimistic that, there's a growing new political alignment around working class political issues here.
Yep, I actually am too. The thing for me was the hats when Trump came out with the Make America Great Again hats, and that's it's a silly nostalgia, but Hillary's response was to, and people I think they've already forgotten about this because a few things have happened since then. But she came out with the hat that said, "America is already great," and it's like, do you want to lose?
I forgot about
Yeah.
that, but I know
It was this amazing thing where, insisting that everything was fine was clearly, the last nail in her coffin. And I think people are also sort of starting to figure out that Trump is not actually the alternative they hoped he would be. But it's very hot in here, so I'm just going to do one more here. We've talked a lot about Medicare for all, but I do think there is, and within DSA, rightfully so, kind of an internal debate about sort of chicken and egg stuff, about social democratic reforms and about electoral work. We have very limited resources. We're the biggest socialist organization in the country, which means we are bupkis. But people are trying to figure out what to do with those precious resources. And a lot of people, they're like, okay, small campaigns, small local campaigns. which obviously there are a lot of perks for that. I mean, you're learning skills, you're talking to people, you're having conversations, and there are people who are, and not to the exclusion of the other, but very heavily focused on the Medicare for All campaign or some kind of social democratic reform campaign, maybe a wage campaign or something. I'm not going to say where my alliances are. But there is this chicken and egg question, and it's like, where do we invest limited resources? Extremely limited resources, cannot stress that enough. And how do we push for a policy when we don't have candidates that are willing to go to the mat for that policy? So, 2 minutes, everyone go. Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, this is, I mean, these debates within DSA, I mean, I'm not a super active member, but, a lot of people around me are, and I hear about the kinds of discussions that go on, and where the priorities should be, is obviously one of those is like the main issue that's at stake, and some people, there's a strong contingent, as I understand it, of people within the organization who want a very strong focus on elections and electoral work. There's, of course, the Medicare for All campaign, the DSA for Medicare for All campaign. There's other ideas that are floating around. I mean, from my point of view, and given the topic that we're discussing, I guess the question is, and the question I've often been, I'm sometimes, asked, because I wrote this article, what do you think about, what we're doing or what somebody proposed that we should do about running in elections, having a candidate trying to get involved in elections. Usually this is at like the local level. And by the way, we saw in a special election last year that a member of DSA, what's his name, Jason Carter? Is that
Lee Carter.
What's that? Lee Carter. He won a race with DSA support in somewhere in Central Virginia, I think it was around Charlottesville, right, or something like that. And there's a lot of other examples of those kinds of campaigns that have happened recently and are continuing. I would say, number one, that it's important not to confuse electoral work by an organization like DSA, which does have resources that are so limited and that is still so small, to confuse that with kind of the first step in the creation of a mass party. It's not going to work quite like that. DSA, in my opinion, as DSA quad DSA is not going to turn into the next Labor Party or Socialist Party at a mass level. However, I've seen some of the work that people are doing, especially I think New York City. The New York City chapter is kind of a hotbed of interest and activity in electoral work. And I've seen the things that some of these activists have been doing. They supported a race for city council recently in Bay Ridge, and they had another one, Jabari Brisport in Crown Heights. And the work that went into that was tremendous, and they actually managed to do on a very small scale. Neither of those campaigns actually won. One of them came quite close. The other one, Jabari Brisport's, he got 28% of the vote, but he did it on only third-party ballot lines, which is quite impressive for a district where the overwhelming majority of the voters are pretty loyal Democrats. 28% managed to vote for this third-party candidate running on the Green Party line, the Socialist Party line. So the philosophy, as I understand it, of what they're trying to do is kind of to do on a micro scale the kind of work that I was proposing that a new party could do as a kind of outside organization that's technically not a party, but tries to gather resources within itself and make those available to a candidate that would hopefully be beholden to the organization itself, rather than being beholden to all the other interests that are fighting for that politician's attention. And I think that it's very unlikely that kind of work is going to sort of add up cumulatively into one day a mass party. I don't think it's going to quite work like that. But what it can do is give people a tremendous amount of experience in understanding, and this is really actually quite important because a lot of people have illusions about how the electoral process or how mass politics works. Gives activists, people whose identity is mostly as activists, gives them some actual practical experience with what the political system in this country is like, forces them to go out and talk to voters ordinary voters, normal people, people who are not have their heads in politics 24 hours a day. Talk to them, see what their concerns are, realize the kinds of challenges that any political project on a mass scale would actually have to deal with. And learn about how, basic skills about how to maintain a voter database and how to run canvases and things like that. Those are all, I think, resources that will probably come in handy in the future in ways that we can't even predict today. So I'm all in favor of those things that those kinds of electoral activities within DSA or elsewhere that people are doing, as long as we understand that that's not sort of step one in the creation of a mass party. And number two, I would say the other thing that could really be positive that comes out of those things is that you could have, and this is what I think is probably the most promising potential, is that you could actually have, hopefully, the emergence of a bunch of like mini Bernie Sanders. I mean, this guy, Lee Carter, he's not, it doesn't strike me as like the most charismatic or politicized, politically deep guy. But in the next time, the next special election or the next state legislative race, one of this DSA or whatever activists might very well stumble on somebody who really has those kinds of skills, those political skills, and it really is a separate skill set being a politician, of charisma, of the ability to articulate complex ideas in a way that ordinary people can understand, to make left-wing ideas seem common sense, the ability to just to talk to people and to have what they say make sense to them, ordinary people. Those are very rare skills. It's hard to discover who has them, and if and when they're able to be brought out, even if it's not Bernie Sanders running for president, but it's so-and-so running for state legislature in Missouri or wherever it is, those voices, I think, can actually end up being really galvanizing effects, the way that Jeremy Corbyn did when he ran for labor leader, the way that Bernie Sanders did when he ran for president. And that it also builds up a kind of a farm team or a bench of people who have those kinds of talents, who can help the socialist movement, the labor movement in the future.
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of what Seth just said. I think politics are really important, both for defensive reasons. We need to protect our interests as best as we can, and politics is about how resources are allocated and power is allocated. So it's always important if you're engaged in real organizing and representing real people in the real world. Politics are important. And then sometimes there's an opportunity to kind of paint a picture within the constraints of the two-party system about what an independent working class politics would look like. And, that's a very positive thing. You look at like Richmond, California, which has had I think a 12-year history now of quasi kind of a independent working class political regime in the city, and that's made some real differences. And some of these things you can sometimes around the corners do that. But I think we have to reject the sort of old school DSA. I'm not pointing any fingers at the new folks here, but the old school DSA sense of being sort of an insider to politics, and there's an illusion that you can be a player there, but the reality is they never built the kind of power to really influence the politics, and they became the tail, not the dog. And that's a problem when you become incorporated into the politics like that. And then the other problem is sometimes you engage in politics, but what do you do when you win? My good friend Tony Mazzocchi said, you can run for dog catcher, but what do you do when you win? Now you got to catch the dogs, and you're enmeshed in this system that doesn't have the kind of resources and power to implement the kind of things that you want to do, and so suddenly you're just removed from the kind of movement that you were trying to build. So I think you have to take a real strategic approach to politics, and you have to couple whatever electoral work you're doing with a sort of vision of what a society that's run to serve the interests of the vast majority of people who work for a living or would like to work for a living expect to be served. And so, to organize around the vision of a society that creates, that guarantees healthcare as a right, that guarantees housing as a right, that guarantees jobs and living wages. I mean, that should be a central task of how socialists, approach a working class politics, and that means enmeshed in issues as well as candidates.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about with the old school of DSA is sort of the Harrington model, which is this idea that, we can be the left wing of the Democratic Party, which, to be very fair to Michael Harrington, made a lot of sense a long time ago. Now I think the limitations of that particular approach to electorals have been laid bare. However, little things are happening, little very impressive things are happening right now.
Well, I mean, I recently wrote an article for Jacobin about the early labour movement institutions in the UK. A lot of British socialism was built up through kind of like cultural institutions. So you had like boxing clubs, teetotal pubs, you name it, the labour movement created it, often by very, very dedicated people in working class areas who were just utterly convinced of the socialist idea. Often these things could turn into parochialism. Other times, so for example, the part of Manchester where my mum's from created like a sect dedicated to the poetry of Walt Whitman, in their sort of understanding of socialism being this kind of like beautiful realization of like human interaction and love. So it was really, really broad, widespread cultural stuff. But quite a lot of people in Jacobin, I think, were quite worried that this kind of community politics, I guess you could call it that, like style article, would feed into a broader debate about like sort of the parochialism of the DSA, or whether they engage in national stuff and whether it's undemocratic, whether they do that, or whether they should be focusing on like local stuff and sort of endearing themselves to local communities where they live and so on. And I can kind of understand that, but I think fundamentally speaking, there shouldn't be any like mutual exclusivity between these ideas. The main focus should be on just the raw immersion of people into the socialist cause and the socialist idea, in a country like America, which means that I'm completely in favor and really thrilled by stuff like Medicare for all. Like, as far as I'm concerned, it's great to do community stuff, but if you organize like a national campaign, something as obviously thrilling as universal healthcare, if socialists are on the front line arguing for these things, and they're the people collecting like the data on the people talking to them, they can make notes about who could be a future sympathizer for them, who would be the type of person who would be very, very receptive if you knocked on the door in 2020 about Bernie. I think it's a huge, huge opportunity just to expand an incredibly important socialist movement right now in America. I think it's really thrilling, and I think you should be, really, really proud of yourselves for what you've done so far.
Could I just say one more thing?
Sure.
Marcus, I didn't ask you to say that, but funny about a national campaign, we've been talking with some folks about the potential to build a national campaign to make Medicare for all the key litmus issue in the 2020 elections. And we're planning to have a national conference June 22nd through the 24th in Minneapolis to sort of hopefully talk about how to build that campaign. So put that on your calendar.
Yep.
And thank you for reminding me about that.
All right, good.
Okay, well, with that, we are going to wrap up. I want to send out all the thank yous to Jacobin, so thank you, Bhaskar, and thank you to Seth, and everyone else who might be tabling. Thanks to Verso, to Hubert, thanks to all the DSAers tabling, thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks to all of our speakers. By the way, you may have noticed there are some documentarians running around filming us because we're so terribly beautiful. But if you want to make sure you're not in some back shot, you can speak to Yel, who's over there. But again, the focus is really on us. But yeah, I really want to thank everyone for coming out. I know this is a really broad topic, and we're nowhere near where we want to be as far as the kind of, advancing a left agenda in this country. But I am highly optimistic, and I really appreciate everyone coming up and speaking.